Amos Yong is J. Rodman Williams Professor of Theology at Regent University School of Divinity in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where he's also the director of the doctoral program in Renewal Studies. His graduate education includes degrees in theology, history, and religious studies from Western Evangelical Seminary and Portland State University and Boston University, where he received his doctoral degree. He's the author or editor of a dozen books, including The Spirit Poured Out on All Flesh, Pentecostalism and the Possibility of Global Theology, as well as Theological Hermeneutics in Trinitarian Perspective. Would you join me in welcoming Professor Yong? Thank you.
Good morning. It's my privilege to be here with you this weekend, so I thank the organizers for welcoming and inviting me to this discussion. Everybody turn and look to your neighbor in the eye, squarely, and repeat these words after me as you are engaging them at the eye level. I thank God that I do not look like you. There is some connection here. But I'll let you discern the connection as we go forward. I've titled my talk, Asian American Evangelical Theology, subtitled, What Do Wheaton and Boston Have to Do with Azusa Street? My charge in the invitation letter is threefold: to describe the main themes and major developments in Asian American theology, to critically evaluate these proposals from an evangelical perspective, and to suggest next steps for evangelical theology in response. So, as a good model minority, I decided to listen to that charge. That was supposed to be funny. There are 4 sections to my talk. The first section, which is a more generic overview of Asian American theology. The second, which is an analysis of Asian American evangelical theology. And the fourth, which suggests some constructive directions, all attempt to fulfill the charge. But section 3 will explore briefly the emergence of Asian and Asian American perspectives in the Philosophical Academy, focusing especially on the proposals of Boston Confucianism to see what, if anything, it can contribute to our theological endeavors. I will suggest that philosophical developments at Boston parallel and can illuminate evangelical theology, perhaps as that is unfolded in the Wheaton tradition, and that both could well be complemented by theological sensibilities on the ground, in the case of my proposal from that of the Pentecostal tradition symbolized by Azusa Street. My overall thesis is that this exercise of thinking about Asian American aspects of the evangelical tradition is important, not just for Asian American evangelicalism, but also for the evangelical theological enterprise as a whole. Okay, so section 1, to fulfill the first of the charges given to me, is titled Asian American Theology Major Developments. I won't read this part of the paper as it basically overviews developments. I overview these developments along 3 lines. I'll briefly summarize them. 1 are developments in mainline Protestant circles. Look particularly at a couple of major contributors to that conversation. Korean American theologian Sang-Hyun Lee at Princeton Theological Seminary, who I indicate is better known as a Reformed theologian who happens to be Asian American, rather than an Asian American theologian who does Reformed theology. Second example is Taiwanese American theologian Chuan Sang Song, who is on the other side of the continent at the Graduate Theological Union, and facing the Pacific Rim has been much more intentional about engaging with Asian sources in reflecting as an Taiwanese American in this context. I also then briefly summarize some other contributors to that discussion. The second strand of developments in Asian American theology I discuss is the Roman Catholic tradition, now looking at Korean Americans like Anselm Min at Claremont Graduate School, who I discussed in some respects as parallel in his work to what Lee does for mainline Protestant Asian American theologians, but Min as a Roman Catholic meaning engaging primarily in the Catholic scholastic tradition and neo-scholastic tradition and bringing those to bear on Asian American concerns. Another example now, switching back from the west to the east, is Peter Fonda, who is chair of Catholic social thought at Georgetown University. Peter Fonda is much more like Chuan Sansong on the West Coast in terms of being much more intentional about bringing Asian sources to bear on his work as a Catholic theologian. The third strand that I look at, besides the mainline Protestant and the Catholic tradition, are developments in biblical scholarship. And we've heard some wonderful considerations already this morning from Professor Yo, who is, I think, one of those who are at the vanguard of Asian Americans reflecting biblically and theologically as Asian Americans, involving Asian American sources. We've heard a little bit about some of the spectrum that's involved in that endeavor in terms of folks across various ideological and even hermeneutical perspectives. So here's my summary of section 1. The proceeding does no more than highlight some of the major developments in the field of Asian American theology. Depending on how one defines evangelical, the achievements noted above have involved scholars with evangelical sympathies, if not commitments or confessional locatedness. Yet institutionally speaking, the major steps forward have taken place in mainline Protestant and Roman Catholic environments. Evangelical participants therein, then, have not been recognized as contributing explicitly to the evangelical theological cause, so to speak. So now I turn to this issue of Asian American evangelical theological reflection, which I entitled the subsection, Struggling for Emergence. The short version about Asian American evangelical theology, and I perhaps should go AAET, okay? Sort of a lot of words here, even for a tongue speaker like me. Come on now, I've heard one amen up here. The short version of AAET is that there's not much to tell. I'll give you the longer version, actually. One edited volume has appeared entitled Conversations, AAE Theologians in Formation. And even here the title admits that we're at the beginning stages of this conversation. While the 6 essayists reflect the diversity of AAE community, none are theologians, strictly considered. David Yu at Claremont McKenna, Tim Sang, founder of the Institute for the Study of Asian American Christianity, are historians, and they urge that religion needs to factor in immigration and racial analyses of Asian American communities, and that the colorblindness of American church history should be acknowledged so as to enable moving beyond Orientalist or assimilationist models of the AAC experience. There are also essays by Peter Cha, a practical theologian at Trinity Evangelical, who discusses the challenges involved in identity formation among second-generation Asian Americans, and by James Zoe, a missiologist at Logos Evangelical Seminary in Los Angeles, analyzing how structural and power issues complicate the assessment of racism, prejudice, and discrimination on both sides of the Asian and Asian American equation. And finally, there are 2 historical theologians. Paul Lim, formerly at Gordon Conwell, now at Vanderbilt, reveals the importance of biography in the construction of AAET, while Jeffrey Ju, a post-Reformation historian at Westminster Theological Seminary, seeks a way beyond both modernist experientialism and postmodernist subjectivism by returning to the gospel. These are the 6 essays in this book, Conversations. As should be evident from this overview, Asian American evangelicals are presently more engaged in sociological and historical analyses rather than with constructive, dogmatic, or systematic theological reflection. New developments may be on the horizon, however. The first issue of the Society for Asian North American Christian Studies Journal, it's called SANX Journal, features a number of exploratory theological articles. One remains at a fairly high level of abstraction in rethinking race in a postmodern and post-colonial climate in ways that are suggestive for how Asian American identity formation can provide missiological impetus, while another operates concretely on the Laotian American ground in thinking about a theology of migration and exile. For the moment, however, we note that the task of thinking theologically as Asian American evangelicals is only barely beginning. The preceding overview raises the question, why have Asian American evangelicals lagged behind in substantive theological reflection when compared to their mainline Protestant and Roman Catholic counterparts. My view is that there are some fairly evident reasons why Asian American evangelicals have not been as engaged theologically as their mainline Protestant or Catholic colleagues. Note, though, that the following are presented as hypotheses to be tested rather than as dogmatic pronunciations about the Asian American Evangelical Theological Academy. I'll give you a few reasons why I think we're a little bit behind here. First, Asian Americans with roots in East Asian and Confucian cultures are in general traditionalists and conservatives. Those are their instincts, if you will. Sociologically, many of these Asian Americans are drawn to evangelical Protestantism because it provides a similarly conservative worldview, albeit one that enables their acculturation and even assimilation into American society. Thus, Confucian conservatism morphs among Asian American Protestants into a form of evangelical conservatism. And Asian American evangelicals tend to attend solidly evangelical seminaries because of these conservative commitments. So whereas mainline Protestant seminaries are much more focused on corporate identities that sort out ethnic, political, and sociocultural issues, evangelical seminaries and their curricula focus more on personal identities, particularly the formation of personal spiritual lives in relationship to Jesus Christ. But what else does evangelical conservatism entail? Drawing from the classic Christ and Culture study of H. Richard Niebuhr, North American evangelicalism has historically been ensconced in the Christ against culture stance, albeit more recently shifting toward the Christ transforming culture posture. Now this involves at worst the rejection of culture, the against culture, which has traditionally characterized evangelical sectarianism. I use that descriptively, not pejoratively. Or at best, it involves an ambiguous relationship with culture, one featuring what might be called a cultural hermeneutics of suspicion that is always concerned about syncretism with the world, culture. Asian and American evangelicals have thus usually understood their Christian conversion to involve either a turning away from their Asian cultural roots, conversion, gospel, walking in the other direction, or a minimizing of these aspects of their identity, emphasizing instead their new life in Christ and as Christians. This fundamental worldview, I didn't say fundamentalist, but this fundamental worldview orientation is reinforced in evangelical seminary education in various ways. Epistemologically, for example, evangelicals up until recently have embraced a modified foundationalism characteristic of the Enlightenment quest for universal knowledge, one tempered by a biblical presuppositionalism and a propositionalist theory language. This brings with it, so it has been assumed, a universal standpoint with the resulting resistance to the pluralism endemic in our postmodern context. Thus, the diversity of cultures might be celebrated, but not if such is thought to threaten the foundations of evangelical certitude. Similarly, at the hermeneutical level, postmodern emphases on historical grammatical interpretation have been assumed to be the central, foundational, have assumed to be central to identifying the scriptural author's message, which is then seen as a norm of Christian belief. This means that biblical interpretation focuses primarily, if not solely, on exegesis, the identification and retrieval of what the biblical authors meant, upon which then the secondary steps of contemporary meaning and application are extrapolated. So perennially then, evangelical hermeneutics has always been concerned with, or worried about, I should say, eisegesis. Precisely what is understood as infecting or contaminating reader response approaches that then skew and distort the pristine message of the Bible. It is these epistemic and hermeneutical assumptions that have undergirded evangelical theological method, long guided by the sola scriptura commitments of Reformation traditions. This is not to diminish the role of reason, tradition, or even experience, particularly among Wesleyan evangelicals, but it is to point out that in general, evangelicals have emphasized the primacy of Scripture in ways that have minimized at best or ignored at worst the various roles and interplay of sources from out of which theological reflection inevitably emerges. Hence, theologically, evangelicalism insists on a biblical orientation that maps the totality of the human experience regardless of cultural particularities. Thus, for example, humankind suffers from one overall problem, that of sin against God, and that one problem demands basically one solution, the substitutionary atonement of the Son's death on the cross. It does not matter that Asians have a shame rather than guilt culture, since in this evangelical framework there is no need to rethink the inherited theology of atonement from Asian perspectives. My point is that evangelical theological tendencies generally urge a universalistic horizon, and in this paradigm, there is less need to articulate distinctive Asian or Asian American or other cultural perspectives, since these are all subsumed within the biblical framework when read in an evangelical way. I suggest that Asian American evangelicals form theologically which, with such sensitivities and sensibilities, have internalized this American evangelical worldview, and in that sense mostly do not see the need to think explicitly from an Asian American vantage point. Rather, the Bible addresses all human beings, and so any plain reading of it will or should be able to access God's word for us at any time and all places. Hence, while there remains an important role for sociological or other disciplinary analyses of the Asian American experience in particular, or even of the Christian life in general, theologically, at least in this Asian American perspective that has been deeply shaped by the North American evangelical theological establishment, there is little work that needs to be done. The basic theological and doctrinal truths of the Christian faith have already been formulated, and these can be found in any evangelical systematic theological text. These are the texts we read in seminary, and these are the texts we internalize. This particular paradigm can be seen, for example, in the recent Cambridge Companion to Evangelical Theology. We've got two parts to that volume. The first part is a list of the doctrinal loci of the inherited theological tradition. And part two of that volume then has chapters called under the label of contextual theologies. So the doctrines in part one are all that we need. The contextual theologies, that's where the Asians are, among other folks. If Asian Americans were to write their own theologies, these would be parochial undertakings with marginal relevance from the evangelical perspective. They would be only for those people, immigrants. I'm a 1.5 generation, which means, by the way, if you're not aware, I was born in Malaysia, but I grew up in the United States. So these Asian American evangelical theologies would be of marginal relevance for those people, immigrants, refugees, exiles, who have not yet assimilated into the broader evangelical culture. Little wonder then that few Asian Americans have ventured into evangelical theological territory. All right, part three. Boston Confucianism and the task of global philosophy. Some theological implications. I want to take a brief tour in this section into philosophical territory for three interrelated reasons. First, the emergence of the phenomenon of Boston Confucianism as a philosophical movement invites theological commentary with regard to the transportability of an Asian tradition into the Western academy. Second, if indeed portable, why would or should contemporary philosophers welcome these Boston Confucians into the discussion? And more pointedly, what other responses are on the horizon? Finally, if philosophical space has indeed opened up for Boston Confucianism, then how has that project fared, and what can Asian American evangelical theologians, and maybe evangelical theologians, learn from these developments in a closely related discipline? Now, the label Boston Confucianism originally emerged as an oxymoron, an insider's joke, so to speak, among attendees of the Second Confucian Christian Dialogue Conference at Berkeley, California in 1991, who recognized the increasing number of participants compared to the first conference in 1988 that were hailing from Boston. The three Bostonians there were all affiliated with Boston University. Robert Cummings Neville, Dean of the School of Theology, who is my Dr. Vater. John H. Berthrong, a transplanted Canadian sinologist, Associate Dean and Professor of Comparative Theology. And Chung Chai-sik, a Korean scholar and social ethicist, and later Walter G. Mueller, Professor of Social Ethics at Boston University. So, of course, I'm a Boston grad. I'm talking about him, all right? Now, absent from the second conference, but also involved in its planning and present at the first and third conferences, the latter at Boston in 1994, was Chinese-born and American naturalized Du Weiming, then professor of Chinese history and philosophy at Harvard University, which geographically speaking is across from the Charles River, across from Boston University, across the Charles River. And so you can see that there's a concentration of Bostonians engaging in Confucian philosophical reflection. Now, while others have come and gone from Boston over the years, and many more still have been students of the Confucian tradition under these scholars, these four have been at the center of this trend in contemporary Confucianism. Neville, in particular, has been responsible for registering Boston Confucianism as a viable philosophical movement with the publication of his book by that title in 2000. At the heart of the Confucian experiment in its Boston form is the conviction that philosophy in global context, now these are all, Neville's a systematic philosopher, okay? Philosophy in global context necessarily involves the great philosophical traditions of the East, one of which is the Confucian with its East Asian roots. More precisely, as Asian philosophers engaging the Western Academy have had to become adept conversationalists in Western philosophical traditions, and have even made original contributions to these discussions, so also in our contemporary global philosophical situation should Western philosophers develop facility in Asian philosophies. Put alternatively, Asian philosophies no longer belong to those merely of Asian provenance, nor are the latter solely responsible for the fortunes of Asian traditions on the global philosophical stage. Globalization just upsets all of those nice categories and compartmentalizations. But this raises the question, does the Confucian tradition belong in contemporary philosophical conversation? Neville's book, Boston Confucianism, responds to this question at least at three levels. First, the Confucian tradition has perennially addressed matters that are of ongoing discussion, including but not limited to philosophy of culture, conceptions of selfhood, social and political philosophy, and most relevant for theology, in the philosophy of religion. Western philosophers should at least consider the classical and present debates among Confucians rather than remaining exclusively Western focused, since ancient Confucian philosophies of ritual interaction have the potential to contribute to the rebuilding of a contemporary world fragmented by religious, ethnic, and ideological strife. Second level of response, Neville argues, Confucian thinkers over the last 2 millennia have also grappled with the classical Western metaphysical and ontological questions regarding being, transcendence, and the relationship between the one and the many. So once again, if Western philosophers would begin paying attention to the Confucian arguments, they will find out not merely parallels in how the issues are negotiated, but perhaps also derive new resources from their Confucian interlocutors to rethink matters, particularly since the Confucian tradition has not generally operated with a robust concept of transcendence. In other words, these ancient topics are now being discussed within a different sort of worldview and framework. Third level, most challenging, however, has been the conservatism of the Confucian tradition, whether articulated in terms of the patriarchal subordination of women, or in the classical terms related to filial piety and ritual propriety. Yet even here, the Boston Confucians, in dialogue with their East Asian counterparts, point to major resources internal to the Confucian tradition, such as the Neo-Confucian principle in each individual, male or female, that enables both personal grounding and communal harmonization, or the notion of filial piety as holy duty, or of ritual propriety, li, as involving an appropriateness that is sensitive to new times, places, and conditions. All of these resources, mixed in with conversations with Western philosophical traditions, can be then drawn upon to leverage against such conservative tendencies, and therefore also contribute to the ongoing discussion of these matters in the world philosophical arena. In each of these ways, then, the argument is that Confucianism is a portable intellectual tradition, and that its Boston guise is one form of its viability in global context. Now, while much more can and should be said, space constraints and major tasks related to this essay require us to step back from the details of the Boston Confucian project and re-engage larger theological issues that it touches upon that are our concern. Of first importance is the question concerning the reception of the movement. The reviews of Neville's Boston Confucianism and other related projects have, on the whole, been positive. Of course, other responses are possible, such as ignoring them, shouting them down, or marginalizing the newcomers to the philosophical party. None of these appear to have occurred, although it is difficult to imagine such reactions given the stature of these Boston protagonists in philosophical and religious studies circles. As I see it, Asian traditions are here to stay in the global philosophic conversation, and even if Confucianism, in its specifically Bostonian dress, were to finally limp off into the sunset. Looking backward and looking ahead then, what is the relevance of this Boston Confucian enterprise or initiative for our quest for an Asian American evangelical theology? Two general comments in this regard. First, as a philosophical movement informed by the, quote, rationalist and egalitarianism of the European Enlightenment mixed with vigorous ethnic and minority communities from all over the world, unquote, this is Neville's description of Boston's primal culture, as he calls it. The Confucianism on both banks of the Charles River is admittedly elitist, even Brahmist, as Neville himself confesses that Bostonians have traditionally been considered. This may be as it should be, since Boston Confucianism is a philosophical school, here loosely considered, not a mass movement. In that sense, the trajectory that charts its emergence and its anticipated trends may be said to correspond, I'm suggesting, as a heuristic mode of thinking, to correspond to the historical role played by Wheaton at the vanguard of the intellectual culture of American evangelicalism. What I suggest is that it is feasible to see Boston in relationship to the emergence of Confucianism as a world philosophical tradition as parallel to Wheaton in relationship to the emergence of evangelical as a major, even global philosophical tradition. Now, if I'm claiming too much for the former, then I may be claiming also too much for the latter. But as the Bostonians are leading the charge to take seriously Confucianism in world philosophical discourse, so also have Wheatonians traditionally been major players at the helm of the evangelical theological enterprise. Certainly, for example, the work of the Wheaton Theology conferences is indicative of how Wheaton College in particular has provided leadership for global evangelical theological reflection. But now, from an Asian American perspective, the Boston Confucian project needs translation so that it can be made more relevant beyond the circle of the philosophically initiated elite. Filial piety and ritual propriety, for example, are important and central themes not only for East Asians, but also for Asian Americans, and, if Neville and company are right, for the world. In that case, the expansion of such notions into global philosophical contexts requires an additional step, perhaps one that involves the possibility of its trickling down to the wider masses. Asian American theologians concerned about rethinking Asian traditions in global contexts may have much to learn from this dialogue with the Boston Confucians on this matter, even as specifically theological perspectives can also augment and extend what is being developed in the philosophical discussion. In short, the philosophical dialogues generated from above, i.e. from the high intellectual ground of Boston Brahmin life, need to be complemented by a Confucianism from below, one that takes into more substantive consideration life as negotiated around the world by Confucians and by others asking questions about filial piety, ritual propriety, and etc. If this is so, then perhaps the discussion can also accompany and inform the evangelical theological conversations from above, emanating from the various citadels of the North American Evangelical Academy. So what might such an evangelical theology look like? All right, my last section is entitled The Future of Evangelical Theology, Asian American Questions, Hopes, and Aspirations. In this section, I can do no more than sketch briefly some possible avenues of exploration for the Asian American project in evangelical theology in particular, and for the evangelical theological enterprise as a whole. I do so under two overarching rubrics simultaneously in response to Wheaton on the one hand and in response to Boston on the other. Now, my response to Wheaton follows the detour through Boston, particularly in light of the Boston Confucian experiment. Here I would urge both my Asian American evangelical associates in particular and my evangelical colleagues in general to take Asian cultural, philosophical, and religious resources seriously in our global context. The retrieval and reappropriation of the Confucian tradition by our Boston Dialogue partners is one positive example of how the East-West encounter is being negotiated in the wider academy. Neville himself is the sole Boston Confucian who is not a trained sinologist, and thus comes to the broad spectrum of Confucianism without the requisite languages. Although this is not an excuse for dismissing the import of the original languages, in our time such may be less important as in previous generations, because here in the present we have quality translations of Asian texts and classics that former generations did not have. My point is not to impose Confucianism on the evangelical theological agenda, but it is to say that there is no good reason for evangelicals in general to neglect Asian traditions in the theological task. And with biblical scholars such as KKO leading the way, this was actually in my text before I knew you were on the panel, so. There are even fewer excuses for ignoring the promise and challenges of Christian Confucian dialogue for evangelical theology in global context. So take that issue up with KK. But why take Asian traditions seriously in the North American context? The short answer to this question is that the forces of globalization, immigration, and transnationalism have produced an Asian diaspora not only in the West, but also around the world. And it is also in this light that I respond as a theologian to the Boston Confucian Project. Without dismissing the import of the philosophical task for the work of theology, I want to emphasize even more than my Confucian interlocutors the on-the-ground nature of the Asian American evangelical experience and how this invites a religious and theological solidarity with all on the ground or on the underside of history. What I mean is that while we cannot and should not dispense with the intellectual project of Boston Confucianism, and while there are important philosophical and theoretical issues at stake in that undertaking for evangelical theology, I'm also reminded that theology is ultimately not only an attempt to scale the heights of understanding the divine, but also of the central dictum that in evangelical theology, the divine is accommodated to the human experience and has been revealed below, in the flesh, in the messiness of human history. If that is the case, then theology needs not only to emerge from out of our worshiping the exalted and transcendent one, but it also needs to discern the traces of God who is immanent in our lives. Theology, in short, cannot remain merely an exercise in philosophical speculation and abstraction, but must be touched by and get its hands dirty with the concreteness of the flesh and the historical process that God himself has entered into. It is also at this point that I want to very briefly supplement the Christocentric emphases of much of evangelical theology with a Pentecostal and pneumatological accent. Thank you. That's all. No. I was just going to give an altar call, but maybe it's a little too early. By Pentecostal, I'm referring not only to the modern charismatic renewal movement related in many minds to the revival birthed out of the Azusa Street mission in the early 20th century, a movement that certainly is a formative aspect of my own religious life and my own theological DNA. But in addition, I'm following out the narrative of the gospel story in which the Christ who was incarnate in the flesh, died and resurrected and ascended in heaven, then poured out from on high the Spirit of God upon all flesh. As first and foremost an evangelical claim, then, I would argue that evangelical theology should be fully Trinitarian, which means Christ-centered and Pentecostally oriented. It is from this Trinitarian vantage point that I see the languages of all flesh, Asian and Asian American dialects included, to have been caught up in the Pentecostal outpouring of the Spirit. This means that and that's not a denominational outpouring, right? This is Acts 2 outpouring. This means that the American evangelical theological conversation between Wheaton and Boston and Azusa Street will be characterized by these three interwoven strands. And with this I close. Number one, a Trinitarian framework. One that takes normatively the scriptural witness and that is deeply embedded in the great theological tradition. But two, a global horizon, one that is dialogically, albeit no less critically open to engaging the great cultural, philosophical, and religious traditions of the East and the South. And 3, a local sensitivity. One is attuned to the practical realities of Asian American life in particular, including the travails of migration, the burden of being moral minority, the challenges of ethnicity in a world of whiteness, and the task of living betwixt and between, which oftentimes means neither here nor there. Asian Americans and other evangelicals who take up this theological charge will in turn challenge, perhaps overhaul, but certainly enrich the evangelical theological conversation, at least for those who are ready to and willing to receive gifts both from the Eastern Shore and from the suburbs and downtowns across the multicultural world that we call America. Thank you.